Just over 10 years ago, I was fresh out of college and had moved back to my parents' house for the free room and food for about 9 months. I was leaving the state for graduate school. My parents were super chill and gave me my own space in the house. However, being a 22-year-old single guy living in a house in the sticks, which they had recently moved about 40 miles south of a major Midwest city, was not ideal. But I didn't have any other options, so I started looking for some work to pass the time and save up some money. Summer turned into winter and I still hadn't found anything solid. By then, I desperately needed to spend more time out of my parents' house. So I took a part-time gig doing some light bookkeeping for a small business owner that my dad knew. It wasn't a real office setup and it didn't pay much, but since my parents lived in the middle of nowhere, I knew I had limited local opportunities to make some cash. The guy was going to pay me under the table as well. At that same time, a friend in the city said if I just paid him $200 a month and helped him clean up, he would let me crash in his living room until I was ready to move out of state. That was all I needed to hear. I took the job. My dad's friend's family had a construction-type business. They helped out with building stuff a little, but it was ultimately more focused on renting out a few bobcats, large augers, drills, and even generators or other low-level construction and farming equipment. It was a small, mom-and-pop type operation where everyone knew everyone, and the office only opened on days when someone was coming by. It was a mutually beneficial situation for the business owners and the locals. Since I had minored in a business-adjacent area and my dad recommended me, they trusted me to go in there for about 15 to 20 hours a week. I would check and file the rental forms, make sure nobody missed a payment date, and if there was a payment plan in place, maybe answer an email or two and discuss prices and availability. It was a super easy gig. The old building where I worked was about 90 years old, at the top of a little hill. The downstairs used to be an old country bar until the 1970s when this family bought it cheap, cleared out the bar, and fenced in the property to use its parking lot area to store all their rental equipment and gear. I could generally come and go as I pleased and work any hours I wanted to, as long as the work got done. So if things were slow and there weren't any rentals for a couple of days, I'd usually go in after 7 o'clock and stay until around midnight or 1 o'clock, since I knew I'd be alone and could listen to music loud and take my time. The office where I worked was on the second floor of the building, above the old bar, and looked out on the long driveway. From my seat, I could easily see out the window, and once or twice, I saw a family of deer or a raccoon scamper by. It was incredibly remote, very still and quiet. So if something unusual occurred, or if something fell off, I would definitely notice it. One night during winter, it had snowed a few inches, and my dad told me to stay in case the roads were that bad. But I had an old SUV, and more than that, I just really wanted to get out of the house. So I went into work anyway, at about 8 o'clock p.m., and I was going to stay until just after 1 o'clock. I'd always left the gate open at the bottom of the hill when I was working, since nobody ever showed up at night. We were literally in the middle of nowhere. I think the nearest occupied house was about 2 miles down the road. To even turn onto our short road, you had to be only coming to our specific building and probably know it was there beforehand. It was a locals-only type of thing and very small. So I'm jamming away to some Fall Out Boy, having some coffee, and I kept glancing at the snow outside here and there, since our one orangish street light reflected onto the ground at the gate, causing the light to shine off the snow in a really cool and pretty way. At one point, around midnight, I went downstairs to the big bathroom to do my business. Then I came back upstairs and got settled back into my work. I probably did about 5 more minutes of work when I glanced outside and saw a huge imprint of something in the fresh snow just below the light. It seemed like it must have been a huge dog or substantial animal had just rolled around on the ground there on its back or something. Since I didn't notice it just 15 minutes before, it had to have happened while I was in the bathroom, or possibly when my back was turned, since I would have seen that type of movement for sure. I shook it off and assumed a big dog, or maybe even a farm animal had gotten loose and maybe was attracted to the light or something. Who knows? At around 2 o'clock in the morning, I was leaving and, as always, got out of my car to lock the gate up. To be honest, I had pretty much forgotten about the imprint in the snow. But when I looked down, I was shocked to see that it wasn't just some disturbed snow. It was undeniably the imprint of a human-made snow angel. If you don't know what a snow angel is, it's when kids lie on their back in the snow and push their arms and legs back and forth. So when they get up, it looks like the outline of an angel. I used to do this when I was a kid, and I'm pretty sure most of you probably did too. So I 100% knew for sure that's what it was. It was deliberately made underneath the light post, but it wasn't from a kid. It was from a very large person, or at the very least, a normal-size adult wearing tons of layers of big winter clothing. I looked up and saw what I already knew. Whoever had made this snow angel could easily look up and have seen me through that window. So they must have waited for me to head downstairs to make this angel. Now, I definitely would have seen or heard if someone drove up to our building, even if I was in the bathroom. So I knew someone had to have walked deep into the freezing cold and snow for a few miles, stopped in front of our building, and then done a snow angel in the small amount of time I wasn't sitting in front of my desk window. I glanced around for tracks in the snow and saw that there was one set that led to the nearby woods to the right of the building. So it was clear the person didn't use the road, but instead came from the opposite side, which made me instantly uneasy since that side was just trees and darkness for miles and miles. I was definitely freaked out now, once I realized that someone had just been this close to me secretly. I knew where my boss kept his gun and always made sure it was there when I started my shift. But I certainly always locked the gate from then on. Thinking about this experience that night, the part that freaked me out the most was that he had to have waited around for me to leave for at least 2 hours just to do that laugh. He didn't know me. I could have been crazy and the type of person to get mad and try to find him and attack him or something. Yet he didn't seem scared or to care while he tried to mess with me. For some random dude, this is probably a story he tells from his point of view to make all of his friends giggle hysterically. But for me, that dude, the one I call Angel, and the snow guy, the one with the laugh, I'll never forget. It was early December, and I was at home this night, spending my day off inside by the fireplace. It was way too cold and snowy out for my liking. I did a bunch of things around the house that needed to get done, but otherwise it was a relaxing day. I had the news running in the background, listening to how high winds and possible blizzards were to be expected starting at night. By 5 p.m., I was already starting to notice it getting worse outside. I sat on the couch and turned on a different channel around 7. Though I could hear wind slamming against the house, and it really did sound like there was a blizzard. I got up and went to the window facing the backyard to see how it looked outside. At first, all I saw was snow rushing to the ground with almost no visibility, but then I saw something else, a figure walking through my backyard. My backyard was pretty big and didn't have a fence, so it wouldn't have been that unexpected if it weren't for the blizzard going on outside. Whoever was out there was just walking at a regular pace, going toward the end of my yard before the snow and darkness took over any sight I had of them. I stayed by the window for a minute, trying to catch one more look and figure out what they were doing, but I didn't see anything. I was honestly scared for them, but also couldn't see why they'd be out there at all. The end of my yard that they were walking to led to a road, but it wouldn't get them anywhere for miles, which was not doable on foot. I went back to the TV, but I still couldn't help thinking about it, and only 5 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. I went over and cracked it open. It was a man in a heavy winter jacket. His nose was bright red, and his face was pale white like he'd been out in the cold for a while. I couldn't know if this was the same person I'd seen in my backyard, but my immediate guess was that it was. "How can I help you?" I asked the man. He let out a humble smile and spoke through shaking teeth that he was waiting for a ride to pick him up and asked if he could stay in my house for a few minutes to shelter from the cold, just until the ride got here. I took a moment to respond because I actually considered it given the state of the weather. It's easy to say that under no circumstance would you let a random man inside your house, but when they're practically freezing to death on your doorstep and asking for your help, the answer on what to do isn't as black and white. I told him he could wait on my porch, which had an overhang that blocked the snow, and offered to give him an old jacket of mine if he needed it. The man didn't look too happy but just nodded and went off to the side and sat on the chair I had out there. I closed and locked the door, then went upstairs to grab my old jacket. It was way too big for me and was in horrible condition, but obviously that shouldn't matter in this kind of scenario. I picked it up and walked downstairs, about to unlock the door and open it, but something stopped me just a moment before. I don't know what it was, but it made me hesitate. I leaned over and looked through the peephole. The man was now standing right up against the door, with his hand on the handle like he was preparing to push it open as soon as I unlocked it. I felt my heart rate increasing as I took a couple steps back and quietly pulled my phone out to dial 911. As I whispered into the phone, I just stared at the door with wide eyes, knowing what was waiting for me on the other side. Once the police said they were on their way, I slowly crept over and looked out again. The man wasn't there, not on my porch or anywhere in my front yard. He was just gone, like he knew that I had called the police. Nothing else was found that night, and no signs of him ever showed up again. What he would have done if I had opened the door, I can't be sure of, but hopefully he never comes back. This story took place when I was 23 years old, close to 10 years ago. I was living in upstate New York in a very rural area with my ex-boyfriend and his family. He and I used to argue quite a bit. One morning, before he went to work, we got into a very heated argument. During this particular fight, he acted majorly juvenile. He jumped out of bed, flipped me the bird, and yelled, "If you don't like it so much, then why don't you go back to the effing Bronx?" That was all the prompting I needed. I threw all my Uggs in my winter jacket, grabbed my cigarettes, and flew out of the house. Unfortunately, I'm an impulsive ass and didn't think to grab my cell phone before I stormed out. I didn't drive, so my only option was to walk. I'll often think of the time that I intended to walk back to the Bronx, as it was a 3-hour car ride upstate, but I just needed to go for an angry, dramatic walk. I realized once I got to this road at the entrance of the trailer park that I had no idea where anything really was around me. I had only lived there a few months at that point, and I really didn't go out a lot. I banked left and just walked to where I knew civilization was. I found myself walking alongside a very busy stretch of road with 18-wheelers flying by, spraying me with slushy snow and soaking my shoes. I then saw my boyfriend driving by on his way to work, and he sped up as he drove past me, evidently still angry about our fight. I thought for sure he was going to turn around at some point, but he never came back. I pressed on, deciding instead to try to walk to my best friend's mother's house, which I knew to be in the same town. It started to snow, and I was losing momentum. I passed by a VFW where a nondescript pickup truck was parked in the drive. It wasn't until I had passed it that I even realized the driver was in the front seat. He called out to me, "Hey, honey, do you need help?" My stomach turned, realizing I would have to accept the stranger's offer. I approached his truck slowly, trying to weigh out my options. He was a clean-cut, seemingly normal older white guy with gray hair and greenish-blue eyes, just average. I blurted out, "Are you a good guy or a bad guy?" and cringed at myself for asking such a dumbass question. He answered, "Hey, I'm a good guy." I wouldn't tell you if I was a bad guy. I ignored the bells going off in my head and got in the front seat with him. As we drove, I realized I had no clue where my friend's mom actually lived. I only knew the name of the road she lived on, but it spanned a good distance, so it wasn't very helpful in terms of finding it. I asked to borrow his cell phone so I could try calling my best friend to ask her where the heck I was going. I called her 3 times and she didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number. I started to feel inexplicably hopeless. After a few minutes, he asked me where I was from and why I was out in the middle of nowhere in the snow wearing pajamas. I explained that I was originally from the Bronx and that I had gotten into a fight with my boyfriend. He paused and said, "Hey, you wouldn't be interested in making a little bit of money, would you?" I chuckled nervously and said, "Oh, no thanks though." He responded, "Well, I just figured since you are from the Bronx." I was now realizing at that point that I was almost definitely in deep __. I muttered, "Oh, sure, and he then eyed me up and down and laughed to himself before sneering, "Sure, she says." I started to panic big time, but knew I couldn't show my fear. I scoured the scenery for a pillowy snowbank that I could land in if I leaped out of the truck, but to no avail. The houses were so few and far in between. I became certain this would be how I met my demise. I'll never know why, but it was at this point that he decided to ask me who I was going to see. I quickly blurted out my best friend's mom's name and her husband's full name. He instantly perked up and explained that he knew the husband and how they used to snowmobile together 20 years ago. I felt the greatest wave of relief when he explained that he knew exactly where his old buddy lived. When we finally pulled up to that big yellow house, it was like arriving at the promised land. I asked for his name. Steve, he said, then asked for mine. I actually gave him a fake name and spat out a quick thank you, and then I ran as fast as I could from his truck to the porch. I cracked through the front door without knocking and locked it behind me. I immediately started crying and running through the house, trying to find my friend's mom. I had awoken her from a sound sleep, but she didn't say a word about it upon seeing how shaken up I was. Once I knew I was safe with her, I explained everything, the weird guy and his sexual proposition, and she listened, horrified and curious at the same time. She made me promise to never do anything so reckless again, and that if I ever needed help to call her. She told me she would ask her husband about him when he got home, about this Steve guy, and find out more about him. I returned to my boyfriend's place that same day and got really stoned to try to forget about the events of that morning. The following day, my friend's mom called me to tell me that Steve was a dangerous person who her husband had to cut off communication with years ago. The last he had heard about Steve was that he had been arrested for some sort of sexual assault. She then went on to point out how incredibly easy it would have been for him to hurt me and leave me just about anywhere on some lonely stretch of road, and no one would ever know where to look for me. Not to mention, I might not have even been found until the snow thawed out.